Many people have one or more favorite sports teams. Most people support these teams because they happen to be the team that's close to where they live. What many people don't realize is that many teams, especially major sports teams in North America, didn't originate in the city where they are today. In some cases, teams have moved multiple times, changing names, and even returned to the city where they originally came from. Learn more about relocated sports teams and the cities they abandoned on this episode of Everything Everywhere Daily.
What do Mattel, Banana Republic, ButcherBox, and Glossier all have in common? They power their businesses with Shopify. Shopify is the most innovative and scaled commerce platform on the planet that also happens to have the best converting checkout on the planet. And that's no industry secret. That's Shopify. Learn more at shopify.com/enterprise.
This episode is brought to you by La Quinta by Wyndham. Your work can take you all over the place, like Texas. You've never been, but it's going to be great because you're staying at La Quinta by Wyndham. Their free Bright Side breakfast will give you energy for the day ahead. And after, you can unwind using their free high-speed Wi-Fi. Tonight, La Quinta. Tomorrow, you shine. Book your stay today at lq.com.
Before I get too far into this episode, I should clarify a few terms that I'll be using. When I say a team has gone away, I'm referring to a team that played games under a certain name in a certain city. The legal entity, which was the team, more often than not, does not disappear when a team disappears. So, at least for the purpose of this episode, I'm making a distinction between a team and a franchise. So again, for the purpose of this episode, to make things easy, the Brooklyn Dodgers will be considered a different team than the Los Angeles Dodgers, even though there is an obvious continuity between the two. That being said, the phenomenon I'll be talking about is mostly a North American phenomenon. It's almost unheard of for a European football club to move cities. It has happened, but it's very, very rare, and it usually only involves moving a short distance so that local fans can still support the team. It's usually just a matter of finding a suitable stadium more than anything else. I've looked, and I cannot find a single example of an English football club that ever moved to a different city. If such a team exists, I'd love to hear it, but my guess is if it happened, it was probably a very low-level team. The reason why this is unheard of for most European football clubs is because the club model they exist under and the system of promotion and relegation that European leagues use. Other countries have seen limited movement of teams. Australia has a hybrid franchise club model. A few Australian football teams have moved. The South Melbourne Swans moved to Sydney in 1983, and in 1996, the Brisbane Bears took over the operations of Fitzroy, which was one of the original AFL teams from Melbourne. Likewise, in Japan, the Nippon Ham Fighters baseball team moved from Tokyo to the island of Hokkaido in 2004. So while I acknowledge that team relocation does occur in other countries, the rest of this episode is going to focus on North American teams because it occurs far more often in North America than anywhere else by a wide margin. In fact, it happens in one sport or another every few years. The reason why it happens so frequently in North America and Canada is because of the franchise system that governs North American sports. Teams in North America are businesses first and foremost. If a community isn't supporting a team, or more realistically, if a local government doesn't support them getting a new stadium, moving the team is always going to be something that they can threaten. Because spots in a sports league are limited, there are more communities that could support a team than there are teams. Because having a professional sports team is considered to give prestige to a city, there are always cities that are looking to attract teams. So with that, let's start with baseball, and one of the first teams to ever relocate, the Baltimore Orioles, in 1903. The first iteration of the Orioles was not the precursor to the team with the same name today. They were one of the inaugural teams in the new American League in 1901. But in the middle of the 1902 season, their manager, John McGraw, jumped ship to the New York Giants of the National League and took with him many of their top players. The team managed to finish out the season under the control of the league and with players on loan from other teams. In early 1903, the American and National Leagues came to an agreement and allowed an American League team in New York City to play alongside the Giants and the Brooklyn Dodgers. The Orioles moved and changed their name to the New York Yankees. Baseball franchises were relatively stable for the next 50 years. There were no new expansion teams and nobody moved anywhere. The problem is that all of the teams were located in the East. The westernmost city with a baseball team was St. Louis, which had both the Cardinals and the Browns. The population was moving west, but that wasn't really reflected in sports teams. The first team to upset this half-century of stability was the Boston Braves. In 1953, they moved to Milwaukee to become the Milwaukee Braves. Most of the reason for the move is because the Braves were the second team in Boston to the Red Sox. The Milwaukee Braves were a rather successful club. They never once had a losing season, and they won the World Series in 1957. And they had several top-tier Hall of Fame players, including Eddie Matthews, Warren Spahn, and of course the great Hank Aaron. The Milwaukee Braves soon fell victim to the same forces that brought them to Milwaukee. There were no teams in the South, and in 1966 the Braves moved to Atlanta, which is where they remain today. Once the Braves moved, the genie was out of the bottle. The next year, the St. Louis Browns, who were perpetually one of the worst teams in the American League, moved. The Browns were so bad that when they finally won a World Series in 1944, new prisoners of war during World War II who reported that the Browns won the series were thought to be spies because the prisoners who were already in the camps thought it impossible that the Browns could have won. Again, they were the second team in St. Louis, and they ended up moving to Baltimore, becoming the new Baltimore Orioles, which they remain today. In 1955, the Philadelphia Athletics made the move to Kansas City. Again, Philadelphia had two teams, but the Athletics were probably the better team in this case, because the Phillies were historically awful. However, that's not saying much because the Athletics were pretty bad too. The Athletics weren't long for Kansas City, as they moved to Oakland in 1968. And that wasn't the end of the journey, because just one day before I am recording this episode, the A's played their last game in Oakland and will be playing in Las Vegas in 2025. The biggest shock to the baseball world took place in 1958. New York, which previously had 3 teams, found themselves with only one when the Brooklyn Dodgers moved to Los Angeles and the New York Giants moved to San Francisco. This was a seismic shift in that it finally brought Major League Baseball to California, but it did so at the expense of New York City. Both teams are still in LA and San Francisco today. The 1960s saw expansion and the creation of new teams, but relocation was still on the menu. In 1961, the Washington Senators, who were also bad but not as bad as the Browns, moved to Minnesota and became the Minnesota Twins. And they became the first team ever named after a state, not a city. In 1969, there were 4 expansion teams, one of which was the Seattle Pilots. They only lasted a single year before moving to Milwaukee to become the Milwaukee Brewers. After the Washington Senators moved to Minnesota, a new expansion franchise was created in Washington with the exact same name, which was odd because the team existed exactly 1 year before, but they totally changed their roster. However, these Senators ended up moving in 1972 to Dallas to become the Texas Rangers. Finally, in 2005, one of the other 1969 expansion franchises, the Montreal Expos, moved to Washington. Because they were in the National League, they took the name the Washington Nationals, which was sometimes used as a nickname for the original Senators. Baseball has had many teams relocate, but it is hardly the only North American sport to have relocated teams. In the NBA, one of the first teams to move was the Tri-Cities Blackhawks. The Tri-Cities was located in the area of Moline and Rock Island, Illinois, and Davenport, Iowa. That franchise was originally the Buffalo Bisons of the National Basketball League. Because the community was so small, they ended up moving to Milwaukee in 1950 to become the Milwaukee Hawks, but then moved to St. Louis in 1954 to become the St. Louis Hawks, and they remained there until 1965 when they moved to Atlanta, where they remain today. The Minneapolis Lakers, named after the city's 13 lakes, won 5 championships in the 1950s, led by Hall of Fame center George Mikan. In 1960, they made the move west to Los Angeles. Oddly enough, they didn't change the name of the team, even though most people don't think of lakes when they think of Los Angeles. In 1957, 2 small-market NBA teams moved. The Fort Wayne Pistons moved to Detroit, where they remain today. The Rochester Royals moved to Cincinnati. In 1972, the team moved west to Kansas City to become the Kansas City Royals. And finally, in 1985, they moved to Sacramento, California, and changed their name to the Sacramento Kings. In 1962, the Philadelphia Warriors moved to San Francisco to become the San Francisco Warriors, and then changed their name to the Golden State Warriors in 1971. In 1971, the San Diego Rockets moved to Houston, where they became the much better named Houston Rockets. In 1973, the Baltimore Bullets made the short move south to become the Washington Bullets, who later changed their name to the Washington Wizards. And in 1978, the Buffalo Braves moved to San Diego, changed their name to the San Diego Clippers, and in 1984, they moved to Los Angeles to become the LA Clippers. In 1979, the New Orleans Jazz moved to Salt Lake City, a city which is known around the world for its jazz music. After a few decades of stability, in 2001, the Vancouver Grizzlies moved to Memphis, and in 2002, the Charlotte Hornets moved to New Orleans and became the New Orleans Pelicans. Charlotte later got an expansion franchise called the Bobcats, but then reverted back to the Hornets name. And finally, in 2008, the Seattle Supersonics became the Oklahoma City Thunder, and the New York Nets became the Brooklyn Nets. Professional hockey had actually a great deal of stability up until the 1970s. The California Seals, located in Oakland, made the rare move east to Cleveland and became the Cleveland Barons in 1967. In 1976, the Barons merged with the Minnesota North Stars. The North Stars wanted to move to San Francisco, but were denied so the NHL could get an expansion fee, which they ended up giving to the owners of the North Stars in 1991. The new team was the San Jose Sharks, and the Sharks were able to take about half the players from the North Stars. The new owners of the North Stars were then compensated with players in an expansion draft. Finally, in 1993, the North Stars moved to the big hockey hotbed of Dallas, Texas, where all the kids grew up playing pond hockey, to become the Dallas Stars. Minnesota was then awarded an expansion team, the Minnesota Wild, which began playing in the year 2000. The Atlanta Flames, located in another hockey hotbed, moved to Calgary in 1980. Atlanta then got an expansion team in 1999 called the Thrashers, which subsequently moved to Winnipeg in 2011. The reason why Winnipeg needed a team is that in 1996, the Winnipeg Jets moved to the Mecca of hockey, Phoenix, Arizona, to become the Phoenix Coyotes. In 2024, they moved to Utah, where they are currently known as the Utah Hockey Club because they still haven't come up with a name. In 1995, the Quebec Nordiques moved to Colorado to become the Colorado Avalanche, and in the ultimate slap in the face to the people of Quebec City, the year after they moved, they won the Stanley Cup. Finally, in 1997, the Hartford Whalers moved from Connecticut to become the Carolina Hurricanes. I'll end this episode by talking about the National Football League, which has seen its share of relocations. In the early years of the NFL, there were many teams in smaller towns that ended up moving to larger cities. The Decatur Stanleys moved to Chicago in 1921 and became the Bears. And it should be noted, in the interest of full disclosure, that even when they were in Decatur, Illinois, they were still a terrible team. In 1934, the Portsmouth, Ohio Spartans became the Detroit Lions, and in 1937, the Boston Redskins became the Washington Redskins. In 1946, the Cleveland Rams did their first of many relocations when they moved to Los Angeles. In 1960, the Chicago Cardinals made the wise decision to leave Chicago and ended up moving to St. Louis. For 22 years, nothing happened until 1982, when the Oakland Raiders left for Los Angeles to become the LA Raiders. In 1984, the Baltimore Colts snuck away in the middle of the night, and I'm not joking when I say that, to become the Indianapolis Colts. In 1988, St. Louis lost the Cardinals when they moved to Phoenix, Arizona to become the Arizona Cardinals. In 1995, the city of Los Angeles went from having 2 NFL teams to having 0 NFL teams when the Raiders and the Rams both left. The Raiders went back to Oakland, and the Rams moved to St. Louis, who had previously lost their team to Arizona. In 1996, the Cleveland Browns moved to Baltimore to fill the gap left by the Colts and became the Baltimore Ravens. In 1999, Cleveland got an expansion team which was called the Browns. And according to NFL history, it is an extension of the original Browns, except for the fact that it really isn't. In 1997, the Houston Oilers moved to Nashville to become the Tennessee Titans. Houston was then awarded an expansion franchise called the Texans, which played their first season in 2002. Finally, in 2017, the San Diego Chargers moved to LA to once again give the city two teams, and in 2020, the Oakland Raiders once again left Oakland to move to Las Vegas. If you're a sports fan in the United States or Canada, there's a good chance you might not have even been aware of some of these team relocations. And it also might get you wondering, is any team safe? Is there any team that is never going to leave their city? Well, there is one team that will never leave because it is almost impossible for them to legally do so. The Green Bay Packers. The reason why it's almost impossible for the Packers to move is because of their unique ownership structure. They don't have a billionaire owner. Instead, they have several 100,000 shareholders that would have to approve the sale and/or relocation of the team. In the event that the team is ever sold, there is a poison pill clause in their corporate charter, which ensures that any proceeds from a sale are going to be donated to charity, so no one could ever make any money off the sale. The only plausible scenario would be one where the NFL simply kicks the team out of the league and it has to fold. But considering the team has one of the largest national fan bases and regularly has some of the highest ratings for nationally televised games, in addition to the longest wait list for season tickets of any franchise, that's highly unlikely. The movement of professional sports teams is a sad reality of sports in North America. And for cities and fans that have lost their teams, it can often be a bitter pill to swallow that will stay with them for years. The executive producer of Everything Everywhere Daily is Charles Daniel. The associate producers are Benji Long and Cameron Kieffer. I want to give a big shout out to everyone who supports the show over on Patreon, including the show's producers. Your support helps me put out a show every single day. And also, Patreon is currently the only place where Everything Everywhere Daily merchandise is available to the top tier of supporters. If you'd like to talk to other listeners of the show and members of the Completionist Club, you can join the Everything Everywhere Daily Facebook group or Discord server. Links to everything are in the show notes.